Hey guys, MrPokke here. So I just want to make my quick little video regarding Ceres, which just dropped I think a couple of days back on starsavior. She is going to be one of, if not the strongest level of crowd controls you're going to be able to see in the entire game. And frankly speaking, she changes up the meta by quite a bit, especially in RTA. So just like the previous guys, we're going to be going through her build, her kit, how you're going to be able to use her. She'll be pulling for her as well as the Arcana, as well as a little bit of a team building and drafting opinion from, I mean, at this point, it's going to be the current global rank 2 for myself personally. So without further ado, let's get into today's content. Alright, so the very first thing, which is going to be for Ceres' kit, the two keywords that she's going to be having is essentially the stun mechanic as well as isolation. Yep, it literally is going to be called isolation. So the passive, we can just kind of take a look over here. Essentially, as long as you're even going to be a limit break 0 after casting your S2, which is always going to be an AoE, hitting 4 targets will then give you 100% AV advance. I don't think I've ever seen a 5 target scenario so far. So if you're going to be using this in PvP and RTA, which personally I feel that's going to be her strongest gimmick, then you are just going to be getting 100% AV advance. Getting more deals will push you all the way up towards, I believe, 35% for single target, which is going to be all the way up to 175%, but that's going to be a little bit excessive, right? So don't worry about this for too much for now. So the entire game is just going to be doing S2 into S3 every single time. You want to cast your S2 first, because after you not only get the 100% AV advance, you then apply this brand new buff called isolation, which reduces preemptive guard chance by 50%. So every single defender in the game, which you're going to be using a preemptive guard, like your Hilde, Heidi, Emily, Carmen, Harley, all the kind of stuff, they will no longer have preemptive guard, period, unless they have another mechanic that brings up preemptive guard by like 100%. But until that happens, you will pretty much bypass every single preemptive guard mechanic for every single defender, which is going to be really nice, not just for your DPS, especially single target DPS like your Charlottes, your Lynn, right, your Robertas, but as well as other debuffers like even herself, Ceres with her S3, as well as Belle, as well as your own Carmen, right? So after you apply your S2, then you're just gonna go in for the S3, which you're gonna be able to inflict our first ever stun mechanic. So if you've been playing gacha games long enough, or any game in particular, stun is pretty much just a hard crowd control. You can't add, you can't move, and that's pretty much it. And then the entire turn is pretty much gonna be skipped out. So it's gonna be an even stronger form of crowd control compared to like Belle's silence. So maybe in the future, I could see maybe like some kind of sleep mechanic where, they're also gonna be hard crowd control unless you hit them. Stun is pretty much just gonna be, they can't move, period, right? And on top of that, you also gain this Western Wind's unique buff, which is going to increase your speed by 25%, meaning you can actually give her another speed buff to stack on even more speed for Ceres. So the general gist of how her entire kit works is you want to cast your S2 to apply the debuffs and everything against every single target, then immediately jump into S3 to land this on the enemy DPS. This could work against pretty much any hyper carry team on RTA, your Cornelius, Rosaria, right, Lynn's, Wedding Appendale, no matter what DPS, the moment they get hit with this S3, the chances of them actually surviving is going to be extremely low if you have drafted properly, because not only do they lose like a huge chunk of action value, they also pretty much cannot move because of a stun. And yes, speaking of action value delay, this S3 comes with a 20% action value delay, which increases by 10% for every single stack of chill. So for typical RTA, you're always going to be starting off with a S2 to S3, and because you start with 2 stacks of chill at the start of battle, this will usually always be 20 plus 30% for a 50% action value delay, which, this combined with your stun, the enemy DPS is pretty much just never going to move whatsoever, and you can just gain an insane amount of advantage against the enemy, right? So that is pretty much how her kit is going to be working. If you guys have any questions, feel free to just join on Discord or just leave me down in the comments below, right? So jumping into Ceres' build and kind of just take a look from the savior part first. The deck I'm going to be using is something like this with Unyielding Destruction plus the 6% crit rate and attack, her signature Arcana, then 1 speed as well as 1 talent of Insight. So a pretty typical DPS build, I would say, if you're going to be going for an additional speed, although there could be a little bit of leeway here and there. So for example, this one I just borrowed it from a whale. I'm personally not pulling for this. I'll explain the before you pull section later on. Then for the attack percent as well as crit rate percent, you generally want to build Ceres as a extremely fast disabler, exactly like how you want to build your Carmen as well as Belt, right? So you're going to max out your sense of speed, get your scale of speed as well as 10 of speed for the plus 15 or rather plus 10 speed buff over here, and then you get yourself the statement of speed for a grand total of plus 18 speed. So generally for a Ceres, you can take a look from my gears, you are just going to be slapping on as much speed as humanly possible. This is not even my best speed gears because I haven't used her that frequently, so ideally you want to stack this on at least more than 220 230 speed, depending on the brackets of your elo. At high-end RTA, which is where I am right now, you typically want your Ceres to be closer to 240 speed because there has been a lot of like belts which can go extremely fast. So for example, the belt that I'm going to be using right now is going to be at, I believe, 244. Yeah, so we do have a 244 speed belt for myself. So you definitely want to make sure that your Carnelia is going to be, or rather your Ceres is going to be the very first unit that actually acts in order to get off her S2 into the S3, right? So the build portion is very straightforward. Just give her as much speed as possible. And then your build is just going to be your 4-piece speed and the 2-piece effect hit rate. I'm also going to be using my effect hit rate main stat because for Ceres herself, she actually does not need any damage whatsoever. Even if you cannot kill the enemy DPS from your S2 and the S3, it's fine. As long as you get off the disable, the rest of the team is going to be able to provide a damage output for you to get rid of the enemy, right? As a matter of fact, if you want to give Ceres more damage, like giving her more crit rate or giving her less speed for more crit rate, you're actually hindering her performance because her number one job is to go first for the S2 and the S3. And if you let someone else take a turn before you, you're very weak to an enemy crowd control, or they just get off their buffs and debuffs and you can't really do anything about it from there, right? So that is pretty much gonna be your Ceres build. Now, just a quick little thing, should you be using her signature Arcana for this particular buff? I personally think it's not really going to be necessary. I just purely took this for a little bit more additional damage because Ceres, she can't actually crit herself anyways, so her crit damage is going to be having a lower value compared to a raw damage percent buff, which is going to be seen right here for 15% damage. And then a little bit more 15% reduced damage taken is just a nice icing on the cake. She doesn't really have any other Arcana that she particularly wants, so if you do not want to grind for a super long journey for the perfect plus 18 speed on the talents, you could just go for the wedding Welt's Ashira Arcana, because Welt's Ashira guarantees you the 10 of speed, so that it makes your journey a lot easier. So that's going to be completely up to you. Now, moving on into the should you pull portion for Ceres, I personally feel she's going to be completely serviceable even at a single copy, which is going to be Limit Break 0, which is where I am at right now today. So for the dupe over here, giving her additional dupes will give her the attack as well as increasing the action value gauge from level 3 and level 4. I do, however, personally think this is not really going to be that important because in PvP, you're always going to be up against 4 targets. So from a single S2, you're already going to be at 100%. So you don't really have too much of a benefit to gain from more than 100%. However, there are 2 scenarios which I could say the dupe 3 as well as 4 could be very handy, but they are very niche. So number 1, if you use Ceres against Roberta, which is pretty common as a counter for Ceres, if a Roberta has an action value advance from her S2, so you can see from this right here, if the particular S2 is going to push Roberta up beyond your own action value. So for example, this is 30% AV advance. So if the enemy Roberta is at say like 78 or 80% AV and they cast an S2, this actually gives Roberta a priority before your Ceres, because even though you can't go beyond 100%, the game recognizes which one has a higher action gauge gain. So while Ceres hits 100% first, it doesn't really matter because Roberta is going to be able to get this 30% AV advance to put her into a priority. So the fix for this is to pretty much just pull yourself a limit break to Ceres that will place her entire highest possible amount of action value gauge gain from PvP from 100% all the way up to, I believe, 120%, right? So this 30% times 4, which is 120%. Another reason why you might want to consider getting more dupes for Ceres is that only at limit break 3, this is where you can actually get 105% AV gauge, which is basically more than 100% against 3 enemy targets. However, I personally think this scenario is extremely rare because for most Ceres matchups, the match ends within like less than like 10 turns, and Ceres either dies or the enemy's gonna die. So I personally don't think this is gonna be that necessary. Maybe in PvE content, but once again, I don't really use it in PvE for myself. So I would say for now, this unit being at limit break 0 is going to be completely valid. I've used her in so many different matches in RTA, all have been very, very nice, right? And another reason why I'm going to be a little bit more conservative for Ceres is because we are going to be getting the summer banner for Luna and Smile very, very soon. And personally, I think I would want to save up more of my premium resources just to pull for the summer units, right? So that's pretty much it for her unit herself. For the Arcana over here, I am actually going to be personally skipping her Arcana. The main reason is just because you can just borrow Arcana nowadays. So you can just borrow all the way up to 5. You can just take one from the whales, and for a couple of strikers, if you want to raise up your stronger strikers, you can then just borrow Ceres Arcana. I would say it is not worth it, especially for free to plays, to pull for limited Arcanas, like your limited support Arcanas. So for example, this is only going to be for strikers. So the best play for your premium resource is to spend your pools for general Arcanas that everyone can use, like for example Tyria Arcana as well as Cornelia Arcana. They're all really nice, or even Lynn's Arcana, because you can use them for whatever unit. So for these kind of like class specific Arcanas, I would just go ahead and borrow from rails, because you realistically will not use them as frequently anyways, right? So that is pretty much it for should you be pulling for Ceres as well as her Arcana. Alright, so that's pretty much how you're going to be building Ceres. Do you want to pull Ceres as well as what she's actually going to be doing? Now I'm just going to be yapping a little bit more about Ceres' team building as well as the drafting process if you do want to play in RTA. From my current experience so far, she has been an extremely strong unit right now, because the meta has shifted drastically with Ceres' arrival. In fact, I would say Ceres is one of the best counters against Cornelia, because the moment you disable and push Cornelia all the way back down, because of the AV delay and the stun, if they cannot cleanse away Cornelia's stun, she's just going to get pushed all the way back. She cannot cast her S3 or S2, so the moment you do enough damage for Cornelia such that she can only proc her immortality and do absolutely nothing else, she pretty much just poses zero threat whatsoever to you, right? So an extremely strong disabler that can pretty much work with any DPS in the game as of this very moment, unless the enemy has 2 different DPS, then that might be a bit of a concern. But Ceres does extremely well into these kind of like hyper carry scenarios, where they essentially cannot stop the rest of your units from attacking, right? The rest of the draft, generally speaking, I would say you're going to be drafting in 3 main ways. Number 1, you want to draft Ceres with a heal day yourself, because you took Ceres away from the enemy, so that you yourself, once you want to use heal day, they pretty much can't have any way to actually stop heal days pre-end guard. Number 2, you can use Ceres as a unit with another disabler, such as for example Bell. Bell is a very strong pick with Ceres, so even if they want to like ban out one of the disablers, having enough disablers on your team such that the rest of the DPS can just one-shot one of the enemy squishy, that will just give you so much value that it is very difficult for them to actually come back, right? So Bell plus Ceres, maybe even Karma Ceres, but I personally find Bell to be my personal favorite because of the AV advance from Bell's personal kit, right? And then one last way you could potentially play up with Ceres in RTA is to just run with another very big nuke AoE DPS, or even single target DPS. So you can see over here, Rosario and Tyria, they are very strong. In fact, I use this particular team comp quite frequently because of the sheer amount of damage you're going to be able to do while you use Ceres to disable their enemy DPS. So it is very hard to actually deal with this. Now, of course, Ceres is not a unit without any weakness. So for example, Ceres is going to be quite weak to enemy counters, namely Roberta as well as Faye. So for my personal matches, I pretty much just ban Faye every single game because I don't want to deal with the 50-50. But if you're going to be going up against a Roberta, you want to see if your Ceres could potentially still outspeed the Roberta after casting on S2. If that is not going to be possible, I would honestly hold off on your Ceres S2 and just cast your S3 first, so that you can at least get off your Ceres S2 in the subsequent turn, right? So that is going to be one very important tip. And another weakness that Ceres is going to face is simply if they cannot, or rather you cannot deal enough damage against the enemy carry even after you disable the enemy carry, or if they're just going to simply cleanse away all of your debuffs, like for example a Welt's Ashra. Although a Welt's Ashra cleanse is not very reliable because she does only cleanse 2 different debuffs, and Ceres can apply your isolation, your freeze, as well as a stun all at the same time with 2 different stacks of freeze. So Wedding Carmen would be a very strong counter pick to Ceres, but generally speaking, you don't really see Wedding Carmen in play that much, especially if you're going to be playing RTA. She's pretty much always going to be banned because she's just going to be that stable, right? So those are a couple of ways to consider running Ceres. I would say if you are a player that doesn't really like to deal with this kind of like counter units. So for example, Faye and Roberta, ban out one of them. I personally ban Faye, so you can still comfortably use Ceres against the enemy matchup. Now, something to keep in mind that is going to be quite scary is that if you're going to be drafting Ceres, you are pretty much just going to be racing. So if the enemy speedsters outspeed your Ceres, namely their enemy Ceres or the enemy Belle, you are going to be in a very, very scary position. So for example, Ceres S2 into S3, if she pulls up another DPS and that DPS also outspeeds your Ceres is just going to get one shot because she's a very, very squishy unit, and people who draft Ceres, they typically do not have enough defensive units to make her survive a big nuke. And even for example, if they use a Hades, Ceres is just so squishy by herself, especially without dupes, that it is very hard for her to actually survive a burst, right? So super, super important for Ceres to get first turn, usually as much as possible, right? If you're going to be going for turn 2, I personally would not even consider getting Ceres. If you're going to be sticking with a turn 2 player, you could potentially just like pre-ban Ceres if you don't want to deal with all of the disables. But for turn 2ers, I would still stick with all of the tanky DPS with a lot of the HP and defensive subsets so they can actually let go of a hit. So Ceres, just pre-ban them and you should be good to go, right? So those are going to be the typical drafting matchups for Ceres. One last thing before I just bounce off of this entire video is that Ceres actually works extremely well in Arena as well. So if you take a look over here into my Arena matchup, I have won 10 consecutive wins so far. I mean, not every single match with Ceres, but she does do super, super well against an enemy for any sort of like a dual DPS setup, especially with Wedding Carmen, because you can just disable the other DPS, so the entire time is just going to be 3v4 very, very quickly, right? So if you are thinking of some way to like break through Arena, then Ceres is definitely going to be able to help you there. For PvE content, I personally wouldn't really think about Ceres that much, solely because Clarissa, Bunny, Charlotte into Welts, Asha, and Heidi or Emily has just been such an oppressive PvE team comp for like, you know, AFK pushing, that I don't really see Ceres giving you enough value because her personal damage is just not going to be very strong, and she doesn't really have as much tempo compared to Belle, because Belle can gain 50% AV advance from an enemy defeat, and she also has accuracy down, which can be very, very nice against bosses. And on top of that, a lot of PvE bosses, they do have an immunity to stun, so Ceres is just really not going to be that useful, right? So with that, we have come to the end of our quick little Ceres guide for you guys. Personally, I would say she is a very, very nice unit for RTA, definitely usable even at a single copy. You don't need any dupes whatsoever. Then the rest of my pulls, I'll just try to save up 40 summon units, and we'll see how that's going to be going, right? Join Twitch, join Discord, use code POKE for 10% of gamer subs, and I'll see you guys next time.